Douglas Murray is an author and associate editor at The Spectator, and he's written an article on the subject entitled, and I quote, "Britain's Fatal Unwillingness to Confront Islamic Extremism." And as you can see, he joins me now. Great to see you, and thank you very much indeed for finding time for us. You'll understand why I'm going to do it this way, but I'm going to take one deep step back into history before then coming to the brilliance of your article. When the IRA was the threat back in the 1970s, Margaret Thatcher and Willie Whitelaw, of all people, said, "We need to talk." Is that possible with Islamistic terrorism in the way that it was with Republican terrorism?
No, absolutely not. There's nobody to talk to. There's no coordinated single leader. The IRA was led by the Army Council. As long as the Army Council decided to have a ceasefire, there was a ceasefire. There were tiny little splinter movements that could, of course, carry out devastating acts of terrorism. But by and large, the IRA was one command structure and some splinter groups. With Islamist extremism, you've just got endless splinter groups. You have the major divide of some Sunni terrorists, some Shia terrorists, some people backed by Sunni extremists, some people backed by Shia extremists. You have every imaginable fallout within each of those groups. You have, of course, the most famous group of recent decades, Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda doesn't even have to give orders. It like ISIS and other extremist groups, it can call on people to carry out attacks. And those people don't even ever need to have had any contact with anyone else from the group that has inspired them. You have preachers like Anwar Awlaki, who's been dead for almost a decade now, who can still inspire people through his lectures online and passed around by extremists to other possible recruits. So the whole nature of this threat is totally different to one like the IRA. And there's always a risk in counterintelligence, counterinsurgency, counter-extremism, that you fight the last war. And to a great extent, that's what Britain has been doing for the last 20 years.
Sure.
And we still really haven't got a grip on this threat.
Absolutely. And in terms of the prevent strategy, and I discussed this with a whole range of folk last weekend, I have a fundamental philosophical problem with it, and that is there are a number of folk who are turnable and can be persuaded by essential logical argument. The vast majority of people who go on to do things like the murder of David Amis or chopping off the head of a young squaddie in South London and the rest of it, they are not capable of being turned. It is a fruitless exercise.
Well, some can be, some can't. I mean, it's just not a surprise that the number of times that somebody actually successfully carries out an attack, we discover that at some point they've come across the radar of prevent. To some extent, you have to accept that as a society. The security service, for instance, can't stop every possible attack. I mean, you can't stop everybody who is on the watch list from getting hold of a knife, for instance. We all wish that you could, but you probably can't. So the society has to work out what the minimal level of risk is that you can tolerate. The issue, though, that if I can just say, one of the most important issues with this is, and as I say in that piece in this week's Spectator, is that, we're only just a week on from the murder of David Amis. And we really haven't even had a percentage of the discussion we should have had about it. I was really struck and actually horrified by watching the tributes in Parliament on Monday, because most of David Amis's colleagues, obviously deeply in mourning as they were completely missing the point. That many of them were talking about him as if he had died of natural causes, unnaturally early, but it was just, one of those tragedies that happens in life. That isn't the case. Their colleague was brutally slaughtered by somebody who is going to go to trial for that murder and whose inspirations seem rather clear already. Now, I understand the unwillingness to prejudice a trial, and that's very important. But after the equally brutal murder of Joe Cox in 2016, there was no pretense by people that we couldn't talk about the possible motive of the murderer. People didn't wait until the trial and eventual conviction of the murder of Joe Cox to talk about what might have driven him. And what I say about the suspect, as we've got to keep calling him in this case, Ali Harbi Ali, is that none of that discussion has happened. We still aren't there. Everyone in Britain always says, after every Islamist-inspired terrorist attack, well, wait till the verdict. You know, we shouldn't prejudge. I've been through this now, like we all have 20 years and more. We never have the discussion in Britain. We never have. Last year in Reading, 3 gay men were stabbed to death in a park on a lovely summer day by a young man who was a Libyan immigrant called Sadal. And Sadala stabbed those 3 men to death, shouting Allahu Akbar, among other things. And people said to me, when I was one of the very few people who wrote about that, people said, oh, don't write about it. You can't talk about the motivation. You can't talk about the fact that he turns out to have said, you know, he got the right people when he killed these 3 gay men. Don't talk about that. You might prejudice the trial. The trial came, the conviction came, the sentencing came. Where were all these people talking about it? Still they don't. Still they don't. In this country, in the United Kingdom, uniquely badly across all of the Western countries, we cannot seem to muster up even the courage to talk about this. And so what happens is you have brutal attacks like the murder of Sir David Amis, and there is effectively silence. When you have a massive terrorist attack like the 2017 suicide bombing at Manchester Arena, where dozens of young people are murdered and have their lives unchangeably altered, we get what? Don't look back in anger. We have the obscenity of the media and the popular culture and the politicians talking in these terms. They say, as they did in 2017, let's look at what the tech companies could do. We had this since the death of David Ames. We had the Home Secretary being questioned by Marr about online harm. Online harm has nothing to do with this. We have the obscenity again and again in Britain of having divergent discussions and never getting round to the real discussion. And instead we have your child's been blown up by a suicide bomb. Don't look back in anger. We have an MP murdered in a church whilst having a constituency, a meeting for his constituents to come and speak to him. And we have just tributes to what a wonderful man he was, which he was. But that doesn't do justice to this. It doesn't even begin to.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.